Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a feast or a banquet, but with a menu that will make you very, very grateful for whatever's in your fridge right now. It's history in its hungriest moments, when famine struck, and people turned to meals so desperate, so horrifying, that you'd rather go to bed hungry than take a bite. The world is starving, desperate, and survival meant eating things you'd never want to admit to. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just sat down to dinner in the middle of a famine. And trust me, you won't like what's on the plate. You open your eyes to the kind of morning where hunger doesn't just tap politely at your stomach. It digs in, with both fists, and rattles your ribs like an impatient landlord. The air is cold, damp, and thin, carrying the faint smell of ashes and something far less romantic, like wet straw mixed with despair. Welcome to famine. Not the kind where you forgot to grab snacks for Netflix night, but the kind where entire villages would trade their last cow for a crust of bread so old it could probably double as a medieval weapon. Around you, people shuffle through the muddy street in silence, their faces pale, hollow, and stretched thin as parchment. Children with eyes too big for their skulls tug at mothers who have nothing to give. The market stalls are ghostly. A few turnips that look like they've already seen hell. A rabbit so scrawny it looks like it lost a fight with a mouse, and stale bread locked behind iron bars like a priceless relic. Everyone looks at the bread the way you look at someone's phone when they forgot to put in a password, longingly, desperately, calculating how quickly you could snatch it. Now, let's not pretend this is some quiet, dignified struggle. Famine is loud. Bellies grow like feral animals. Babies scream like broken fiddles, and the church bells that used to call people to mass now toll for funerals almost every day. And when hunger gets bad enough, people start eyeing things they'd normally step over. Grass, bark, rats. If you've ever judged your roommate for reheating weak, old pizza, congratulations. You've got the moral high ground over half of medieval Europe. I duck into a cottage that smells of boiled moss. Because yes, moss was on the famine menu. The family inside is gathered around a pot of greenish water. The father stirs it with grim determination, like he's hoping the motion alone might summon flavor. His wife drops in a handful of weeds, the kind you'd usually rip out of your garden and curse at. The kids watch with the wide-eyed awe of people about to eat what might pass for soup if you squint hard enough. When they finally ladle it into bowls, the taste is bitter earthy, and so thin you're not sure if it's food or just a rumor of food, and they eat it gratefully. It's one of those moments that makes you rethink every time you've groaned. There's nothing in the fridge. Imagine explaining to a starving medieval family that you meant the fridge was full of food you didn't feel like eating. The truth is, famine turns the rules of appetite upside down. Things you once gagged at suddenly seem edible, even desirable. Leather shoes, softened in boiling water. They became chewy, salty meals. And if you're wondering how that worked, just picture yourself chewing on your wallet during a blackout. Not tasty, but technically survival. Some desperate folks in 14th century Europe really did slice up their boots and stew them. A Michelin-starred nightmare, but it kept you breathing. And then there were rats. The scuttling, plague-carrying kind that darted through the alleys. In cities like Paris during sieges, rats became fine dining. People roasted them on spits, sold them in markets, even argued about the best seasoning. Picture a street vendor hawking skewered rats the way we line up for hot dogs outside baseball games. Only these hot dogs had whiskers and tails. But here's the thing, once desperation rewires your taste buds, nothing is truly off the table. That includes things still twitching. During the Great Famine of 1350-1317, some chronicles whisper of people turning to carrion, animals already dead and rotting. Imagine gnawing at a horse that's been lying out for days, flies buzzing like some grotesque dinner bell. You'd hold your nose, chew fast, and hope the meat killed your hunger before it killed you. Of course, when you're in the middle of it, you don't think about the poetry of survival. You think, eat or don't eat, live or don't live, that's it. Which makes it all the more chilling when whispers of cannibalism creep into the chronicles. Not always openly admitted, but recorded in those careful, horrified lines that monks like to tuck into the margins of their manuscripts. The kind of lines that say, "Some were driven by hunger to unspeakable acts." You don't need footnotes to know what that means. If you're sitting there clutching your popcorn, don't worry, you're safe. But imagine yourself in a cold, famine-struck village where the snow hasn't melted for weeks, and your neighbor's stew smells suspiciously familiar. And if you think leather shoes and rats were bad, wait until you see what desperation did to bread. You'd think bread would be safe. Bread is comfort. Bread is the foundation of every happy carb, loaded memory we cling to. But famine has a way of turning bread into something else entirely. Something unholy. When grain was gone, people got creative, in the kind of way you get creative with leftovers at 3 a.m., except much, much darker. Enter famine bread. Sounds quaint. Like an artisanal trend you'd find at a hipster bakery, doesn't it? Something wrapped in wax paper with a handwritten label, rustic survival loaf. But famine bread wasn't made with flour, at least not much of it. People ground up tree bark, weeds, moss, and sawdust to bulk it out. Yes, sawdust. Imagine chewing bread that tastes like a carpenter's workshop. Imagine each bite leaving splinters in your gums. People still ate it. Not because it filled them. It didn't. But because it gave the illusion of eating. It gave their jaws something to do, while their stomachs wept. One 17th century record describes bread so heavy with ground oak bark that people's teeth broke. You're hungry, starving, and every bite is also a trip to medieval dentistry. Which, let's be honest, wasn't dentistry at all. The irony is bitter enough to choke on. They called it the bread of desperation, and it wasn't exaggeration. Now, try to picture sitting at the family table with this bark and sawdust loaf in the middle. Everyone tearing at it silently, each bite cracking teeth and tearing gums, but no one daring to stop because what else was there? Kids gnawed at it until their mouths bled. Mothers softened it with water to make it swallowable, and fathers pretended it was enough, and still people wasted away. Because bark bread doesn't nourish. It's just a slow, motion starvation disguised as a meal. It makes you think twice about rolling your eyes at gluten-free bread today. At least it won't splinter your gums. And famine bread wasn't the only nightmare. There were soups brewed from nettles and thistles. Weeds boiled until they turned into a bitter sludge. There were gruels made of bran so coarse it scraped its way down your throat. In the Irish Famine, some families mixed ground nettles into porridge, turning breakfast into something that tasted like burning grass, and left your tongue stinging. Every spoonful was a reminder that food was gone, and all you had left was what grew wild and didn't poison you immediately. But sometimes, even the poisonous plants made it in. When choice is between eating something that might kill you and eating nothing at all, you roll the dice. Monks recorded cases of people eating ergot, infected grain, the same fungus that makes you hallucinate, convulse, and, if you're lucky, die quickly. Imagine famine turning your last meal into a psychedelic nightmare, where your body twists in agony, while your neighbors argue over who gets the last spoonful. And then there's famine's cruelest trick, turning once valued animals into food. Horses, dogs, even cats found themselves on the table. In besieged cities, dogs were roasted openly in markets, and cats vanished from alleys with suspicious speed. Paris, during its many sieges, became famous not for romance but for roasted rat, dog stew, and cat pies. Picture strolling along a boulevard where today you'd find bakeries and cafes. But instead every shop window offered up something with fur still clinging to it. And people bought it eagerly, because hunger doesn't care about affection for your pets. One English soldier during a siege wrote of being offered a cat dressed as rabbit. He knew it wasn't rabbit, but hunger doesn't let you be picky. He ate it anyway, and swore it was indistinguishable, save the claws. That's the kind of detail that sticks in your throat long after the meal is gone. And the most disturbing part, for many that was considered a good famine meal. Rats and cats were delicacies compared to what came next: dirt. Yes, actual dirt. In France during the 1690s, there are reports of people eating clay bread, loaves made with a mixture of earth, and whatever scraps of flour they could find. Heavy, gritty, choking lumps of baked mud. People ate them because hunger convinced the body to chew, swallow, and pretend it was satisfied. But dirt doesn't digest. It fills, then destroys, clogging stomachs until death comes anyway. It was survival through illusion, and illusion kills slowly. Now, if you're imagining yourself standing in one of these famine kitchens, surrounded by mossy stews, bark bread, and roasted rats, you're probably thinking, I'd never eat that. But hunger isn't a polite suggestion. Hunger is a tyrant. Hunger is louder than reason, prouder than pride. Hunger convinces you that chewing bark is a feast, that gnawing on leather belts is indulgence, that dirt might save you. And it convinces whole communities at once. Which is why, when famine got truly desperate, the line between what was edible and what was unthinkable disappeared entirely. Stories whispered of parents abandoning children, of graveyards emptied not by burials but by something darker, of neighbors disappearing without explanation. And if you think bark bread and rat pies were the bottom of the barrel, wait until you see what hunger drove people to take from one another. You know that moment when your stomach growls so loud in public you swear people across the room heard it. Multiply that by 1,000, stretch it across weeks, and you'll begin to understand the kind of hunger that drove people to do things best left buried in footnotes and whispered rumors. Famine doesn't just gnaw at your stomach, it rearranges your mind. You stop seeing the world as streets, neighbors, and families, and start seeing it as meat, bones, and calories. I step out of the smoky cottage, leaving behind bark, bread crumbs, and nettle soup fumes, and into the village square. The air is different here. People's eyes don't just look hungry, they look predatory. There's a tension in the crowd, the kind of atmosphere you feel when two people are about to fight in a bar, and everyone else suddenly goes quiet. Famine makes everyone watch everyone else too closely. That's when you hear the stories. Not shouted, not public, whispered. A man digging in the churchyard late at night, shoveling not for treasure but for bones. A mother who disappeared with her youngest child and returned the next day alone, claiming the baby had fallen ill. Strangers being followed home on dark roads and never arriving. These weren't legends made for firesides, these were rumors wrapped around truth, too terrifying to say aloud but too real to ignore. Cannibalism. There, I said it. The word nobody in those times wanted to breathe, but everybody knew lurked behind the shadows of famine. And before you recoil in modern disgust, remember, when your ribs are showing, your children are crying, and every field is a graveyard, the line between I'd never and I might is paper thin. Chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315 describe horrors unspeakable, which is medieval monk code for people were eating people, and I'm too horrified to write it directly. Some accounts talk of travelers ambushed not for coin but for flesh, of parents reduced to madness, of children abandoned, then harvested. These monks didn't like writing about blood, but their ink records shudder with it. Now, before you pat yourself on the back and say, I'd never stoop that low, ask yourself, you've gone 2 weeks without food. Your stomach feels like it's devouring itself, your legs no longer carry you straight, and your neighbor dies in the night. Do you bury them? Or does your mind start whispering calculations you'd never admit to? That's famine's final cruelty. It doesn't just starve bodies. It starves morality. It strips dignity like meat from bone. Which is why chronicles of sieges are some of the most chilling reading you'll ever do. Cities cut off from supplies became laboratories of desperation. Take the siege of Leningrad in the 1940s. Yes, leap forward a few centuries with me. People boiled wallpaper glue for sustenance. They ate sawdust cakes. And yes, reports of cannibalism surfaced, often punished brutally when discovered, but never eradicated. Hunger is stronger than law. Back in medieval Europe, during famines and sieges, officials sometimes nailed decrees to doors warning citizens against the eating of man's flesh. Imagine living in a city where the mayor has to remind you not to eat your neighbor. That's not just disturbing, that's society at its breaking point. And still, life in famine carried on. People worked, prayed, fought, and whispered. They'd sit in half-empty churches while sermons begged God for mercy, And all the while, everyone kept a nervous side, eye on their neighbor. Because when hunger claws this deep, every stranger becomes a question. Will they feed me? Or will I feed them? It's in these times that trust dissolves quicker than a cube of sugar in tea. Families guarded their dead fiercely, not just out of grief but out of fear someone else might claim the body. Entire burial grounds became contested spaces. Grave diggers were accused of selling corpses, not burying them. And the worst part, many accusations were probably true. That's the thing about famine, it doesn't just kill, it corrupts. It turns kindness into suspicion, compassion into risk, and survival into a selfish art. It makes you realize that morality is often just a luxury of the well-fed. But don't worry, it wasn't all body snatching and whispered horrors. Sometimes famine desperation led to, let's call them culinary experiments. Because when flesh wasn't an option, or was too risky to admit, people tried to create food out of anything. Animal bones ground to powder and boiled into soup. Candle wax scraped into stews. Even dirt again. Because apparently the human brain never stops thinking soil might one day be filling. It's a strange thing. Standing in the middle of a starving village or a besieged city, and realizing how far people will go just to silence that gnawing ache inside. Hunger shrinks the world down until nothing else matters. Not honor. Not laws. Not even humanity. And if you thought neighbors eating neighbors was the darkest it got, wait until you see what happened when famine walked hand in hand with disease. The smell always gives it away first. In famine, rot is everywhere: spoiled grain, unwashed bodies, stagnant water, and the stink of graves dug in haste. But when disease joins the feast, the odor changes. It's sharper, heavier. Like the air itself is carrying decay straight into your lungs. You walk through streets where coughs rattle like broken engines, and you know hunger wasn't enough. Now the plague has pulled up a chair at the table. You see, starving bodies don't just waste away. They collapse, leaving the immune system as fragile as old parchment. One bad cough in a crowded hut, and suddenly the entire family is coughing, bleeding, or shivering with fever. Famine doesn't travel alone. It invites dysentery, typhus, and that grim reaper favorite plague. And the terrifying part is how fast hunger made you a willing host. Picture it: you've managed to choke down bark bread or a rat, and for a brief, flickering moment, you think you've beaten hunger. Then the cramps hit. Food your body can't handle twists inside you, and suddenly you're sprinting for a latrine. If there even is one, and not always making it. Medieval villages became open-air testaments to what happens when desperation meets digestion. And let's just say, it was not a fragrance anyone bottled. The doctors, if you could call them that, had theories. Bad air was the culprit, they said. So people stuffed herbs in their noses or wore masks that made them look like deranged bird people. But none of that stopped the sickness. Because the truth was cruel. When your body is starving, it doesn't fight disease, it welcomes it in like an honored guest. It's strange, isn't it? People feared famine because it starved them. But what often killed them was the disease that famine made possible. And this deadly pairing left towns emptying faster than bread shelves. Priests prayed louder, bells tolled longer, but the graves filled quicker. And those who survived, they carried the look of people who had seen the bottom rung of existence, and lived to tell of it. Now, here's where famine and disease together pull off their most twisted trick: they change the food chain. Cats and dogs vanish first, either eaten or dead of sickness. Then vermin thrive, fattening on corpses and garbage, multiplying faster than people could trap them. And guess what vermin carry? Fleas. And guess what fleas carry? Bubonic plague. Congratulations. Your dinner last week just introduced your funeral next week. And before you laugh in comfortable modern smugness, think about it. We hoard toilet paper at the first sign of a shortage. Imagine what happens when the supermarket shelves go bare for real, when hunger claws at your stomach, and the neighbor's cat looks suspiciously plump. In cities, famine and plague sometimes created a choreography of horror. Picture narrow lanes lined with wagons full of corpses, families abandoning houses, the living stepping around the dead just to get to a water pump that might already be infected. And every cough, every sneeze, every shadowy figure hunched over was a reminder. It wasn't just hunger you had to fear anymore. It was hunger's older, crueler sibling. And yet, people clung to rituals. A starving mother still rocked her child, even if she knew the fever was winning. A priest still lifted a chalice, even if he was coughing blood. A baker, if you could call him that, still sold loaves of ground bark and straw, even if it killed his customers slowly. Humanity limped forward, one desperate act at a time. You stand there, in the midst of it all, watching the world shrink to hunger and sickness, realizing how thin the line is between survival and collapse. The line isn't a wall, it's a whisper, a breath, a single crust of bread. And if you thought famine mixed with plague was a nightmare, wait until you see what happened when people tried to celebrate in the middle of starvation. Imagine this. You haven't had a real meal in weeks. Your ribs are sharp enough to play like a xylophone. Your stomach is basically chewing on itself. And then suddenly, bells ring out. Not for death this time, but for a festival. A feast. A celebration. Because even in the depths of famine, people somehow decided, you know what we need right now? A party. It sounds ridiculous, right? Like hosting a potluck, when everyone's fridge is empty except for half a jar of mustard and a questionable pickle. But here you are, swept up with the crowd, trudging toward the town square, wondering what exactly counts as a feast when the fields are bare, and the cows have long since been converted into soup. What you find is equal parts tragedy and comedy. A wooden table has been dragged out, and covered with offerings a handful of dried beans. A turnip so shriveled it looks like it died twice, a loaf of bark bread, the same kind that probably cracked teeth last week. Around it, musicians play, if you can call two fiddles and a drum, musicians. Their music sounds more like teeth chattering than a merry jig, but the people clap along anyway, because what else are you going to do? Cry? Everyone's already done plenty of that. The tradition of feast, days in famine, wasn't about abundance. It was about pretending. Pretending for one night that you weren't starving, that life still had rhythm, that God or the saints or sheer stubbornness might notice your effort and reward it with rain or harvest. So people danced, thin legs wobbling, faces pale, arms flailing in something that could almost be mistaken for joy. Someone passes you a treat. It's a cake. If you define cake as flour scraped from the bottom of a sack, mixed with sawdust, and baked until it could stop an arrow, you bite it anyway. It crunches like chewing wood shavings, and the flavor is earthy. Not earthy like mushrooms, earthy like actual dirt. And still, people nibble, nod, and smile like they're tasting delicacies. Because sometimes pretending is the only thing left. It reminds me of when modern people post glamorous Instagram shots of avocado toast, when in reality it's just bread with a smear of green mush, but the filter makes it look divine. Same energy. Only here, instead of brunch aesthetics, you've got starvation survival disguised as ritual. In some villages, desperate banquets turned into grotesque parodies of food. Effigies of oxen made of straw were paraded through the streets, not because anyone expected meat, but because looking at the shape of plenty felt like remembering what plenty was. Sometimes people even roasted these straw oxen, filling the air with the bitter smell of burning hay, as though the smoke itself might trick their stomachs into believing. And then there were miracle plays and processions. Public theater meant to plead with heaven. Actors dressed as saints marched barefoot through mud. Villagers carried icons draped in cloth, and everyone sang hymns with cracked voices. Hunger gave the songs a sharp, desperate edge. The words weren't just prayers, they were demands. You could almost hear the unspoken bargain, give us food, or watch us waste away at your altar. You watch as a child joins the circle of dancers, twirling with limbs so thin they look like reeds. The adults cheer weakly, clapping along. Not because the performance is good, but because hope is contagious, however fragile. For a moment laughter flickers through the crowd. For a moment hunger loosens its grip. But then the music stops. The illusion breaks, and the cold truth presses back in. There's still no food. The celebration dissolves into people slipping home, slower and sadder than they came. Tomorrow, they'll return to chewing bark, boiling weeds, and waiting for the earth to offer something. Anything. Because famine festivals weren't really about joy. They were about survival. About keeping people moving when every instinct screamed to give up. They were, in their way, a ritual against despair. And if you think pretending to feast on sawdust cakes was strange, wait until you see what people were willing to actually swallow in famine's darkest hours. The next festival you stumble into isn't in a cheerful town square. It's in a half-collapsed barn that smells of smoke, sweat, and something far less pleasant. People are gathered, huddled close, their faces lit by tallow candles that sputter and hiss. At the center is the banquet. On the table lies something that, at a distance, might look like roast meat. Step closer, and you see it's not beef, not lamb, not anything noble. It's a dog, skinned, roasted poorly, the paws still stiff, the eyes sockets empty. People stare at it with hunger so sharp it borders on madness. A priest blesses it anyway, muttering prayers that sound more desperate than holy. Then slices are carved, handed out like communion. You take one, because refusing feels worse than eating. It's greasy, tough, and leaves an aftertaste that lingers like guilt. And here's the unsettling truth. This wasn't rare. During sieges, dogs and cats disappeared first. Man's best friend became man's next meal. Rats followed. Pigeons. Horses. Prized for battle one day, boiled for stew the next. It wasn't about preference, it was about whatever still moved, or had moved recently enough. The grotesque irony was that sometimes famine banquets centered around food nobody wanted in normal times. A stew made of blood drained from animals, mixed with stale water, thickened with whatever weeds were nearby. The smell was metallic, like licking a coin. The taste was worse. People slurped it anyway, eyes closed, as if pretending it was wine. You've probably seen those modern detox smoothies that look like swamp water but cost $10 a cup. Imagine one of those, only it actually is swamp water, and you're drinking it because your survival depends on it. In Ireland during the Great Famine, reports whispered of bread, made from seaweed and clay, kneaded into stiff loaves that scraped the throat raw. Villagers gnawed on them anyway, grimacing as grit crunched between their teeth. Imagine chewing on a handful of sand and calling it dinner. The hunger didn't care, it demanded. People obeyed. Then there were famine puddings. A mix of ground acorns, weeds, and sometimes candle wax shaved into the pot for fat. Sweet, right? Except the acorns were often unprepared, and raw acorns are toxic. People ate them anyway, risking poison rather than facing another night of emptiness. Some died not from starvation but from the very feasts meant to save them. One chronicler in the 17th century described a bizarre feast in a German village where people, unable to find flour, ground old bones into powder and baked them into bread. Bone bread. White, chalky, brittle, and barely digestible. The record doesn't say how it tasted, but you can probably imagine like chewing dust mixed with regret. It filled stomachs, yes, but it also filled graveyards. And yet, there was always an element of performance, even in these horrors. People gathered, shared, blessed, and pretended together. There's a strange dignity in it, as though admitting defeat was more unbearable than eating the inedible. You realize famine, feasts, weren't about food at all. They were about hope masquerading as dinner. When you step back into the night, the stars are sharp against the black sky, and your stomach twists with what you've just eaten. Not just hunger now, but the nausea of survival's cost. You look at the villagers filing away, their faces calm, almost relieved, and you understand this wasn't a meal. It was a ritual to keep despair at bay one more night. And if you thought dog roasts and bone bread were disturbing, wait until you find out what famine did to the dead themselves. You've been walking for hours, the mud sucking at your boots like it's trying to drag you under. The village is quiet, eerily quiet, and you notice the silence is heavier than hunger now. It's the kind of silence that makes you glance at windows, wondering who inside is alive and who isn't. Hunger has already emptied bellies. Now it's emptying houses. And there it is, the churchyard. Normally a place of rest. Normally solemn. But famine twists normality into mockery. The wooden crosses are crooked, half fallen, the earth churned and uneven. As though restless sleepers beneath are trying to claw their way out. Except they aren't the ones moving. It's the living, creeping in the night with shovels and desperate eyes. You step closer. At first, you think it's shadows. But then you see them, two men bent over a grave, hands muddy, sweat gleaming in the candlelight. The smell hits you first, a sickly sweet rot that makes your stomach lurch. They're not burying. they're digging up. The chronicles always try to dance around this part. They use phrases like acts unspeakable or driven by necessity to dreadful things. But here in the flesh, there's no dancing. People are prying open coffins, pulling at what's left of neighbors, strangers, even family. Hunger doesn't care about dignity. Hunger rewrites the rules. One man lifts what might once have been a thigh bone. His companion hacks at it with a dull knife, muttering about soup. You can't look away. The scene is grotesque, horrifying, and worse, ordinary. Because famine has been gnawing at this village for so long that the dead are no longer sacred. They're calories. And before you recoil too quickly, think about it. You've heard people in modern times joke about eating their arm off when they're hungry. Well, famine villagers took that joke and gave it teeth. But it wasn't just corpses dug from graves. The freshly dead were guarded fiercely by their families. Not for ritual or mourning, but because the neighbors might come knocking. Imagine grieving your child, your spouse, and having to lock the door because someone might try to take them. Not to steal jewelry, but to put them in a stew pot. That's famine's darkest theft. It steals the humanity out of mourning itself. And sometimes, the line blurred even further. Rumors whispered of families who didn't wait until the grave. Who shared the flesh of their own. Monks writing about the great famine of 1315 described mothers, consumed by unnatural cravings. Historians debate whether those records exaggerated. But when you're standing here in the stench of this churchyard, watching bone soup being planned, it's not hard to believe. The hunger was so vicious that in some places, authorities nailed decrees warning people not to eat the dead. Imagine that. Not laws against theft or murder, laws against corpse cuisine. Picture your mayor today stepping up to the microphone and announcing, "Reminder to citizens, please do not eat your neighbors." That's when you know society has collapsed. Of course, corpse eating wasn't the only horror. Bones were boiled for marrow, ground for powder, turned into broth so thin it looked like dirty water, but still carried the bitter tang of rot. People swore the smell of bone broth never left their nostrils. Once you inhaled it, it lived in you, reminding you forever of what desperation can taste like. And then there was the corpse bread. In some German famines, dirt scraped from graveyards, rich with decomposed human remains, was mixed with flour and baked. They didn't call it corpse bread, of course. They called it famine bread. But everyone knew. The earthy bitterness wasn't just soil. It was humanity recycled. The eerie part. People didn't just choke it down. They shared it. A woman handing her child a crust, both pretending it was normal. A man breaking it in half for his neighbor, as though generosity made it less horrifying. Community rituals persisted even as food itself became unspeakable. You can smell it everywhere now. The mingling of earth, decay, smoke, and desperation. Walk through the alleys and you'll see faces leaner than skulls, eyes darting toward the churchyard like wolves circling a carcass. People know what's happening. Nobody says it. They just pretend not to see, the way modern folks avoid eye contact on a subway when someone's acting strange. Survival requires selective blindness. And yet, even in this nightmare, humor found cracks to slip through. Chronicles tell of gravediggers joking about the menu. Gallows humor, yes, but humor all the same. Because laughter is another kind of survival. You laugh, you cope. Even if what you're laughing at is a pot of marrow broth, simmering over a stolen coffin nail fire. The worst part, though, wasn't what famine did to the dead. It was what it did to the living who had to carry the memory. People who survived carried the stench, the taste, the images of gnawed bones and hollow-eyed neighbors for the rest of their lives. Survivors of sieges wrote memoirs decades later that still couldn't put the memories into words. They circled them, hinted at them, scribbled around them. But the core horror stayed unsaid. Because how do you write down that you fed your child soup made of bones dug from a grave? It's strange, standing here, because you feel the weight of it. Not just the hunger, not just the rot, but the silence around it. These were the stories no one wanted to tell, but everyone lived. You almost feel like whispering an apology to the dead. But you know hunger doesn't care about apologies. Hunger is louder than guilt. And if you think graveyard bread and bone broth were the bottom of famine's pit, Wait until you step into the kitchens of the wealthy, who somehow feasted while peasants starved right outside their doors. You're walking away from the churchyard, your nose still full of rot, when suddenly the air shifts. There's a smell, and it isn't death this time. It's roasted meat, fat dripping, spices perfuming the wind in waves that feel almost insulting. Your stomach contracts so sharply you nearly double over. Because here, just beyond the starving hovels, lies a manor, and the people inside are feasting. The first thing you notice is the sound, laughter, loud, easy, careless laughter that bubbles out through stained glass windows. The kind of laughter that belongs to people who have never chewed bark bread, never boiled shoe leather, never crouched over a grave with a shovel. For them, famine is just a word. For you it's a smell, a taste, a weight in the belly. You creep closer, drawn by hunger and fury. Through a crack in the shutters, you see at long tables groaning under platters of food. Capons stuffed with almonds, pork glazed with honey, fish swimming in butter sauce so thick it glistens in the candlelight, fruits, exotic and fresh, piled in baskets like jewels. And everywhere, goblets of wine spilling red onto the tablecloth as hands slam them down in toast after toast. The rich had their own rules in famine. Where peasants gnawed at bark and bones, lords doubled down on indulgence. They didn't just eat, they flaunted it. Records from French famines in the 14th century describe nobles hosting extravagant banquets, even as their serfs collapsed in the fields. A show of wealth, they called it. You might call it cruelty served on silver platters. Imagine being outside, stomach hollow, while inside they argue over who gets the last candied fig. You hear a servant announce a new dish, swan roasted in its feathers, the smell of charred plumage mingling with rich meat. People clap as it's carved, skin crackling, juices running. You bite your tongue until it bleeds just to stop yourself from screaming. What makes it worse is the waste. Half-eaten dishes shoved aside, goblets tipped over, dogs gnawing on bones more nourishing than anything peasants have seen in months. And tomorrow, the scraps will be tossed, sometimes literally onto the street. That's when the poor swarm like crows, snatching at moldy crusts, sucking grease from discarded bones. To the rich, it's trash. To the starving, it's treasure. You know that sick feeling when you see someone throw away a whole plate of fries because they're too full? Multiply that by famine. That's the scale of insult you're watching here. But here's the paradox: the rich weren't untouchable. Sometimes, their indulgence painted a target on their backs. Chronicles tell of mobs storming manors during the Great Famine of 1315, dragging nobles into the streets, looting their cellars, tearing apart banquet halls with hands that hadn't touched real food in weeks. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was rage, sharpened by the sight of excess. You step back into the cold, away from the warm glow of the manor, and you realize a famine wasn't just about empty bellies. It was about division, the haves and have-nots. Those who starved and those who smirked. The smell of roasted pork was as much a weapon as any sword. And the irony, sometimes the rich poisoned themselves. Heavy foods, spiced wines, meats layered on meats. Their bodies groaned under the strain. While peasants wasted away outside, nobles were busy clutching their stomachs inside, victims of gout, indigestion, and overindulgence. If starvation didn't kill you, gluttony just might. Call it history's cruel balance. In some accounts, nobles even staged mock famines. Yes, you heard that right. They threw theatrical dinners where guests pretended to be poor, eating meager rations for the fun of it. Then, at the climax, servants swept in with platters of real food, and everyone laughed at the joke. Picture a costume party, where the theme is your neighbor's starvation. If you think modern rich kids throwing homeless chick fashion shows is tasteless, well, famine nobles invented the genre. What's most haunting, though, is the silence of the poor outside those walls. They didn't shout. They didn't riot every night. They watched. They smelled. They swallowed their saliva and turned away. Because famine wears you down until fury becomes just another luxury. Still, not all manors escaped unscathed. Sometimes famine crept inside. Servants, underfed themselves, stole from kitchens. Bread vanished from cellars. Rats found their way into pantries. And occasionally, even nobles had to face the same bark bread and thin broth as the peasants. Though they ate it behind closed doors, never admitting their tables had emptied. You step back farther now, the laughter fading, the cold creeping back into your bones. Behind you, the feast rages on. Before you, the village crouches in silence, broken only by coughs and hollow moans. It's like watching two worlds occupy the same space. One dripping with grace and wine, the other gnawing on weeds and dirt. And if you think this divide was grotesque, wait until you see how famine forced people to turn not just against the rich or the dead, but against each other. Neighbor against neighbor. Family against family. In ways too chilling to forget. It starts with a whisper. Always a whisper. They have food. No one says it loudly, of course. Famine turns words into dangerous weapons. But once that whisper begins, it spreads like smoke through the village. Someone claims to have seen your neighbor with flour on his sleeves. Or someone else swears they heard the scrape of a spoon against a bowl after dark. That's all it takes. Hunger sharpens ears and invents evidence. Suddenly every glance, every cough, every shadow looks like proof. And here's the terrifying thing: once suspicion takes hold, famine becomes less about gnawing your own bones, and more about tearing at someone else's. You don't just starve, you starve with paranoia. Take the Great Famine of 1315. Chroniclers describe entire communities unraveling under suspicion. Neighbors accused each other of hoarding. Families broke apart over the last crust of bread. Priests, men supposed to embody charity, locked away their pantries and pretended to cough whenever someone knocked at their doors. Imagine your childhood friend suddenly eyeing you like you're hiding a ham under your shirt. You probably aren't. But famine doesn't care about truth. Famine cares about fear. You pass a cottage one night. The shutters are tight, the fire hidden. But you smell it, porridge. Thin, watery, but real. Your stomach twists so hard it feels like your insides are clawing upward. You want to knock, to beg, to offer anything in exchange. But you know how this goes. If you knock, they'll deny it. If you push, they'll scream. And then the rest of the village comes running, not to help you, but to drag them out. Accusations turn into torches faster than you can say, "We're all in this together." There's a saying that famine makes neighbors strangers. That's too polite. Famine makes neighbors predators. And then there's family. The people you swore would never turn on you. But hunger has no loyalty. Parents abandon children at the edges of forests, whispering promises to come back and never returning. Brothers fist fight over the marrow in a bone. Wives hide scraps under their skirts, not from thieves, but from husbands. You like to think blood ties are sacred. Famine laughs in your face and says, "Not when your belly is empty." It's not just rumor. Historical records are full of these betrayals. During the Russian famine of 1601, villagers reported parents sending children to monasteries for safety, which really meant one less mouth to feed. In Ireland, during the potato blight, men abandoned households entirely, walking to cities in search of work and never looking back. You might call that survival. Families left behind called it desertion. And somewhere in between lay the truth: famine doesn't give you the luxury of morality. You sit by a fire one night with a family who's let you in. They're thin as reeds, but they still have something in the pot. It smells faintly of cabbage, though you're not sure if that's optimism more than fact. The father ladles out bowls, each portion so small it's almost symbolic. You lift it to your lips and sip. Warmth floods your body like mercy. Then you notice the youngest child isn't given any. She stares at the pot, silent eyes huge. No one acknowledges it. The bowls pass around again, thinner now, but still, none for her. And she doesn't complain, she just stares. You feel a coldness settle in your gut alongside the broth. Because you understand, the family decided she's the weakest. Better to let the stronger ones survive. And she knows it too. That's the worst part. Famine teaches children how to die quietly. If you're thinking surely it couldn't have been this bad, history begs to disagree. In 17th century Finland, letters describe siblings turning on each other, children locked in barns so they wouldn't steal food from their parents. In China's great famines, entire villages fled in opposite directions, scattering families so thoroughly that some never found each other again, even when the famine ended. Imagine losing everyone you love not to death, but to hunger's cruel arithmetic. And all the while, superstition thrived. People accused each other of witchcraft, convinced someone must be cursing the fields. If your neighbor's plot yielded one extra potato, clearly she'd signed a pact with the devil. So the village would drag her out, torture her, kill her, and still go home hungry. Famine makes logic optional. Blame becomes the only food that fills bellies. Of course, it's easy to mock this from our modern kitchens, where the biggest betrayal is someone finishing the last slice of pizza without asking. But in famine, that slice isn't a snack, it's survival. And suddenly, the person across from you isn't a brother, or a neighbor, or a friend. He's competition, a rival's stomach. And there can only be so many survivors. The scariest thing famine does isn't emptying fields. It empties trust. It hollows out the bonds that hold humans together. And once that's gone, the world doesn't look like home anymore. It looks like a battlefield where the weapon is hunger, and the enemy is everyone you once loved. You step away from the fire, from the cottage, from the whispers. The night feels colder than ever. You thought the horror of famine was in what people ate. But now you realize the deeper horror is in what people became. And if you think family turning on family is as dark as this story gets, wait until you see what happens when famine strips away even humanity itself. And people start feeding not just on food, but on the unspeakable. You don't mean to think about it. No one does. At first, it's just a shadow that drifts through your head when your stomach cramps too sharply. A thought so vile you swat it away like a fly. But hunger is patient. It circles back. And every day it comes closer until one night, when you look at the person sitting across from you, you don't see a face anymore. You see meat. Cannibalism in famine isn't some invention of horror movies. It's a grim, persistent reality that lurks at the edge of starvation. In the Great Famine of China during the 1870s, official records mention families trading children, not because they were heartless, but because no one could stomach eating their own. It was a grotesque kind of courtesy. I'll take yours, you take mine, and maybe we'll both sleep better, pretending it isn't really our blood we're boiling. You want to think you'd never go that far. But then you remember the graveyard bread, the boiled leather, the rats skittering just out of reach. And you start to understand why some people cross that line. Hunger strips away every layer of civility until the only question left is, do I die with my morals intact? Or do I live and carry the taste of human flesh in my mouth forever? The smell is the worst part. People say it lingers longer than any other meal. Sweet, cloying, impossible to scrub from your nostrils. Soldiers at the siege of Leningrad in World War II described the scent drifting from houses when desperate families resorted to cooking the dead. One man wrote later that he could never again eat pork because it reminded him too much of those days. Imagine carrying that association for the rest of your life. A ham roast isn't dinner anymore. It's a memory you spend decades trying to forget. And yet, the disturbing part isn't just the eating. It's the waiting. People sitting by bedsides, not praying for survival, but watching breath grow shallower, eyes glaze, bodies still. Because death meant food. You don't tell anyone you're waiting. You don't even tell yourself. But you notice when your sister's cough worsens, when your neighbor's skin turns grey. Hunger rewires your compassion until it becomes calculation. If you think that's too monstrous, let's step into 17th century Russia. Chroniclers describe entire villages reduced to cannibal feasts, bodies hacked apart in barns, the pieces boiled into stews, as if disguising the truth could soften it. Officials who rode into those villages sometimes turned away without interfering, not because they approved, but because they didn't dare stop it. Hunger, after all, doesn't negotiate. And here's where famine throws one last cruel joke: rumors. Even if you never touched flesh, people might still whisper that you did. In medieval Europe, desperate communities often accused the poorest of cannibalism simply to make sense of missing children or neighbors. Sometimes, the accused were burned alive. Starve, and you might die. Eat, and you might live only to be executed for it. Talk about a lose-lose dinner plan. You want to look away, but famine doesn't let you. Because the deeper truth is that cannibalism isn't just about food. It's about the collapse of everything we pretend makes us human. Once you cross that threshold, you're no longer part of a community. You're an exile with blood on your lips, and yet some lived because of it. You might despise them. you might swear you'd never do the same. But if your stomach were empty enough, if the world had stripped you to the bone, well, let's just say, hunger has a way of making liars out of everyone. And if you think cannibalism was the worst famine could conjure, wait until you see the strange, desperate inventions people cooked up when flesh wasn't an option. Recipes so grotesque and absurd they blur the line between survival and madness. By this point, your stomach isn't just empty, it's inventing new levels of emptiness. Hunger does strange things to the mind. At first, you dream of roasted meat or steaming bread. But after weeks, your imagination shifts. You start fantasizing about anything that might pass your lips, no matter how absurd. And in history, famine forced people not just to dream, but to actually eat those fantasies. Take bark bread. It sounds almost poetic, like something a forager might serve at a trendy eco-restaurant today with a drizzle of honey and a 25 price tag. In reality, bark bread was desperation disguised as sustenance. People peeled the inner layers of birch or pine, ground it into powder, and mixed it with whatever flour they could scrape together. The result was a hard, grey loaf that filled the stomach, but offered about as much nutrition as chewing on a shoe, which incidentally was the next course. Yes, leather soup, shoes, belts, harnesses. Anything tan became a candidate for the pot. Boil it long enough, and you could soften it into something vaguely chewable. Soldiers under siege gnawed on boots until their teeth cracked. Diaries from the siege of Leningrad mention entire families boiling wallpaper paste because it contained traces of starch. Imagine sitting around a table, sipping broth that tastes like wet cowhide, nodding at each other as if to say, well, at least it's warm. Then there were clay cakes. Not a nickname, actual clay. Mixed with a little flower grass, shaped into patties, baked until hard. They gave the illusion of eating. You could chew them, swallow them, feel the weight in your belly. And then, of course, the cramps began. Your body isn't designed to digest dirt. But famine isn't about nourishment. It's about tricking your gut long enough to survive another day. You'd be amazed how many people risked death by clay just to quiet the gnawing inside. Moss was another delicacy. Boiled, it turned into a slimy green jelly that clung to your throat. Think of it as famine's version of pudding. If pudding could make you gag, while still leaving you hungrier than before. Some accounts describe families scraping moss off rooftops, mixing it with a few grains of rye, and serving it in bowls as if it were stew. Desperation doesn't need seasoning. And don't forget cats, dogs, and horses. Beloved companions became meat the moment famine crossed a certain threshold. Paris during the siege of 1870 is infamous for its menace featuring rat stew, roasted cats, and even elephant from the city's zoo. Yes, elephants. Can you imagine tucking into a steak carved from an animal you once admired behind iron bars? History isn't subtle about its ironies. Still, nothing captures famine's grotesque creativity better than the recipes people wrote down. During Ireland's Great Hunger, some pamphlets actually suggested nettle soup or boiled weeds as substitutes for potatoes. It sounds like satire, except starving families really tried it. The so-called soup was bitter, foul, sometimes poisonous. But when your options are nettles or nothing, you gamble with bitterness. There's a strange kind of comedy in all this. People took these foods seriously, writing instructions as if they were fine cuisine. One 18th century Swedish recipe advised mixing half bark flour with half rye flour, warning that too much bark may disturb the stomach. Imagine someone politely advising moderation when your alternative is starvation. As if you're going to say, oh, thanks, I'll only have one slice of tree today. And here's the oddest truth. Some of these famine foods stuck around, not because they were good, but because memories linger. In Finland, bark bread is still remembered, baked occasionally as a grim heritage dish. A way of saying, look what our ancestors endured. In other words, famine has a long aftertaste. Sometimes literally. You walk through the village now, and you see people gnawing leather straps, chewing weeds, slurping green moss stew. They look at you with hollow eyes, as if daring you to mock them. And you don't. Because you know that tomorrow, you'll be boiling the same belt, chewing the same clay, pretending it tastes like survival. And if you think bark and clay were bad enough, wait until you see what famine did to faith. when churches and sacred rituals became as much about food as about salvation, and starving bodies crowded into pews not for prayer but for bread. The bells ring, but they don't sound holy anymore. They sound hollow, like stomachs. Each toll feels less like a call to prayer, and more like a reminder food isn't in the fields, it's in the hands of God. Or at least, in the hands of men who claim to speak for Him. You walk into a church during famine, and the air is thick, not just with incense, but with hunger. People crowd the pews, not for salvation but for scraps. Some come hoping for bread baked from the parish's storehouses, others for the promise of miracles. Everyone comes with the same hollow look. It's not faith that draws them here. It's the faint hope of filling their stomachs. The priest mounts the pulpit, robes loose on a body thinned like everyone else's. He speaks of patience, of trials, of manna in the desert. But the congregation isn't thinking of manna as metaphor. They're thinking of manna as a meal. They shift in their seats, tongues heavy, eyes darting toward the altar where a small basket of offerings sits. Bread meant for ritual. Bread that looks suspiciously edible. And here's the irony. Famine made religion both stronger and stranger. People clung to prayer like a lifeline, whispering nirvanas or Buddhist chants, or Quranic verses with the desperation of gamblers placing their last bet. But at the same time, famine exposed faith as bargaining. Deliver us from hunger, people cried, and we'll believe. And when relief didn't come, faith curdled into anger. Priests were accused of hoarding grain. Monasteries were stormed for their cellars. Sometimes holy men were dragged from their pulpits, their robes torn away by hands more interested in bread than blessings. Think about it, religion has always promised bread as symbol, bread of life, daily bread, breaking bread together. But in famine, those weren't metaphors, they were cravings. Imagine sitting through a sermon on loaves and fishes, while your belly growls so loud it drowns out the gospel. That's not inspiration, that's torture. Of course, miracles had their own market. Reports from medieval Europe describe statues of saints, weeping, and crowds rushing to collect the tears, believing them to be nourishment. In India during droughts, processions carried sacred icons through parched fields, hoping the gods would look kindly and send rain. In China, entire villages burned incense on mountain shrines, watching the smoke rise like prayers with calories attached. People weren't just asking for grace. They were begging for grain. And here's where famine shows its twisted humor. Sometimes those prayers worked. Not because heaven intervened, but because the church finally cracked open its granaries. Grain hidden, for emergencies, was distributed at just the right moment, reinforcing the illusion of divine timing. Faith, famine style, was often logistics wrapped in liturgy. Still, there were darker corners. Accusations that priests hoarded not just food but indulgences. In the Great Irish Famine, many Catholic tenants accused Protestant landlords of offering soup only if they converted. Soupers, they were called, and the insult stuck like grease. Imagine choosing between your eternal soul and a bowl of thin broth. Hungry enough, an eternity starts to look negotiable. You look around the church now. A mother rocks her child, lips moving in whispered prayers, though her eyes keep darting toward the door, as if expecting a miracle in the shape of a sack of flour. An old man clutches a rosary, fingers trembling, but when the collection plate passes, he drops in a stone instead of a coin. What else is there to give? Hunger empties not just bellies but pockets. Faith becomes the only currency left, and it doesn't always buy much. And yet there's humor here too, bitter as it may be. Imagine sitting in a pew, ribs poking through your tunic, while the priest drones on about fasting as a spiritual discipline. You want to laugh or scream. Fasting. You've been fasting for 6 months, Father. Holiness isn't your problem. Bread is. When the sermon ends, people don't linger to shake hands or bless each other. They crowd the altar, hands outstretched, eyes desperate. Some kiss the stone steps, not out of devotion but out of habit, hoping that humility might translate into handouts. The priest raises his hands to bless them, but all they see is whether he gestures toward the cellar. You slip out into the night, leaving behind the dim glow of candles and the sharp smell of incense. Outside, the stars scatter across the sky like crumbs on a table too high to reach. And you realize a famine doesn't just gnaw at bodies. It gnaws at faith. turning sacred spaces into marketplaces of hope, miracles into bargaining chips, prayers into hunger chants. And if you think hunger only twisted faith, wait until you see what it did to the body itself. How famine sculpted people into walking skeletons, hollowed their faces, and left them marked long after the hunger was gone. You don't need a calendar to measure famine anymore. You measure it on bodies. The mirror, if you're unlucky enough to look, shows a stranger, ribs like fence posts, cheekbones like knives, eyes sunken so far back they look like cave entrances. Hunger doesn't just starve you, it sculpts you. At first it's subtle, clothes hang looser, belts notch tighter. You joke about the famine diet, as if misery could be softened by humor. But then your skin dries, lips crack, hair falls out in brittle clumps. Nails snap like twigs. Every step becomes a negotiation with your legs, one more pace, just one. Soon, you're not walking anymore. You're swaying forward, a puppet on strings too thin to hold. The smell changes too. Villages reek of sour sweat, of bodies wasting away. Doctors, the few who tried to observe, described the scent of hunger as metallic, a strange sweetness that clings to starved flesh. It's the smell of the body devouring itself. Fat first, then muscle, then, finally, the last reserves in organs that were never meant to be fuel. Your body eats itself like a snake swallowing its own tail. The eyes are the worst. Wide hollow, too large for the skull. Children in famine look decades older. Their gaze steady and unblinking, as if they've already seen the end. Adults shrink into shadows of themselves, their voices rasping thin as if words cost more energy than they're worth. Conversations fade. Silence grows. And silence, in famine, is louder than screams. Of course, history has no shortage of descriptions. During the Bengal famine of 1943, witnesses wrote of skeletons with skin, people crawling through the streets, bellies swollen, limbs stick-thin. In the Irish famine, emaciated bodies lined roadsides, mouths stained green from grass. In Russia, corpses became so common that people stopped reacting to them. Imagine stepping over bodies the way you might step over puddles. Hunger normalizes horror. And yet, somehow, life persists in small humiliations. You fart constantly because your stomach is full of grass. You cough up black phlegm from eating soot or charred scraps. You scratch endlessly at lice that thrive on your weakened body. If famine doesn't kill you directly, infection waits with open arms. Diseases love the malnourished. Typhus, dysentery, cholera. Famine is their red carpet. Your immune system waves a white flag, and everything else rushes in. The cruelest trick is the belly. It swells grotesquely, as if mocking the starvation inside. Children with distended stomachs look as though they've eaten too much, when in fact they've eaten nothing. The world stares and mistakes famine for gluttony. History is full of irony, but none as sharp as a starving child mistaken for full. You might think death would be quick. It isn't. Hunger lingers. Days stretch into weeks, weeks into months. Your body clings to life with stubbornness you didn't know it had. And the dying doesn't look heroic. It looks like collapsing quietly in a corner, breath slowing, eyes glazing. Sometimes it looks like sleeping. Which is why famine villages are full of people nudging the still, whispering, "Are you awake?" Just to be sure. And the survivors. They never leave famine behind. Long after food returns, they hoard scraps, hide bread under mattresses, panic at the sight of empty shelves. Their bodies may recover, but their minds stay branded. Ask anyone who lived through the Great Depression why they saved jars of buttons, and you'll see famine's ghosts still sitting at the table. Hunger is a memory that never loosens its grip. If you're wondering where the humor is in all this, it's dark and bitter. Like famine itself, imagine a medieval doctor prescribing more fresh meat and milk to a starving peasant, as if they'd simply forgotten to shop, or a noble clucking about peasants being lazy while stepping over their skeletal bodies. History has always been full of clueless advice, but famine made it lethal. And so, here you stand at the end of it all, surrounded by bones, whispers, scars carved into bodies and memories alike. You realize famine isn't just a lack of food. It's a presence, a shadow that twists faith, poisons trust, reshapes flesh, and lingers long after the last bite has been swallowed. The worst part, history isn't finished with famine. It circles back, century after century, place after place, wearing new names but bringing the same hollow hunger. And somewhere, even now, Someone is staring at an empty pot, wondering what they'll eat tomorrow. You close your eyes. You can almost hear the crackle of a fire, smell the faint sweetness of bread baking. Real bread, not bark or clay. For a moment, your mouth waters. Then you open your eyes, and the illusion fades. Hunger is still here. It always has been.